Welcome back. So we finished the last session talking about government policies. Now we'll turn our attention to how consumers and producers do inside the market mechanism, right? The discussion takes the form of talking about consumer welfare, then we'll talk about producer welfare, and then we'll have a brief discussion around what markets can actually do, what is the efficiency of markets, and how market outcomes can provide a signal as to what goods need to be provisioned inside the economy. Right. So the roadmap here is to first talk about consumer surplus, right? So we want to ask the question, how well are consumers doing with the outcome that the market is providing? Can we measure it? And if we can measure it, how do we put a number on it? And we can figure out how well consumers are doing inside this particular market, right? On the other end of the spectrum, again, going back to the basics, we visualize the economy as consisting on one side consumers, people who want to buy goods and services, and producers, people who are able to produce these goods and supply them to the market. So we care about what is happening to consumer welfare and what is happening to producer welfare as well. Okay. And finally, we'll briefly discuss, are the markets actually efficient, right? Do markets always produce a desirable allocation of resources? And if that's not the case, can we improve upon the market outcomes, right? So that's basically what we'll do in the next session is we'll start discussing cases where the market provide the provision of the goods and services that the market is able to uh, uh, raise might not be the socially desirable amount, and in that case there is a role for government to step in and improve upon the market outcome. Okay, so there is a deep philosophical discussion to be had on this issue. In a certain sense, markets generally guarantee efficient outcomes, but they might not always guarantee equitable outcomes, right? So when we started off the course, we talked about the constant tension inside economies between efficiency and equity. And the difference is basically, with efficiency, we want to get the most amount of production with the least amount of resources expended, right? That's what we mean by efficiency. To be efficient is in a way of saying we are very good at using the available resources to produce as much as possible using as few resources as possible. Equity, on the other hand, is a discussion around, okay, so we produce all these goods and services. How do we distribute the goods and services, the final goods and services that the economy is able to produce among all the people inside the economy, right? So markets don't really guarantee any kind of a fair distributional outcome. Markets are an efficient mechanism to just make sure that you can get the most amount of goods and services out of the economy using the least amount of resources, right? So we'll discuss these things because there's always been a constant debate between, if you believe that the markets are actually efficient, should you actually interfere with the distributional outcomes that the market then provides? And the short answer is you probably would want to do that, and we'll consider a few cases where uh, you want you might want to improve upon the outcome that the market provides. Right. So let's start from the basics. So let's start talking about welfare economics. Right. So in welfare economics, we begin with the market mechanism, right? We start with the market mechanism and we start talking about allocation of resources, right? When we talk about allocation of resources, the first thing is that how much of each good is produced inside the economy, right? So there's a wide array of goods that an economy can produce. How much of each of these goods gets produced? Which producers will produce it? So there's a wide array of producers with different costs. So which producers get to produce and supply into this market, and which consumers consume it, right? That's basically how we allocate resources. First, we figure out how much gets produced, then we figure out who gets to do this production, and then we figure out who gets to consume the final outcome of this production, right? So with welfare economics, what we're trying to understand is that for different allocation of resources, it can affect economic well-being, right? So, as the name suggests, it studies welfare. It studies how well consumers and producers do inside an economy at different allocation levels, right? So, To begin this story, we first turn to the consumers, right? And the story, as usual, is fairly straightforward, it's fairly intuitive. The first idea to understand is consumers' willingness to pay, right? The WTP, as we shorthanded it, as we abbreviated it, the willingness to pay, right? And it's what it sounds like, right? This basically captures a buyer's willingness to pay for a good, the maximum amount that the buyer will pay for that particular good. Okay, so it gives us an indication of the value that the consumer puts on each of these goods, and different consumers in this economy are going to have different willingness to pay, right? So, for instance, if you consider a good like an iPod, it's a bit of a dated example, but suppose you want to buy an iPod, different consumers don't all value the iPod the same way, right? Anthony, for instance, is willing to pay up to $250 to get an iPod because he really values it. Okay. John, on the other hand, likes having an iPod, but his willingness to pay is fairly low, and there is a wide uh, variation between all the different consumers in this economy and their willingness to pay. Okay. So, if the price of the iPod is $200, suppose the market price, Apple produces it and sets the price at $200 for an iPod. Now, the question is, okay, given that the price is $200, what is the total quantity demanded? Okay. To understand what the total quantity demanded when the price is $200 is to ask the question, who will be willing to buy this product when the price is $200? And the intuitive answer is the only consumers who will buy this product when the price is set at $200 are consumers whose willingness to pay is greater than the asking price, right? The asking price is $200. If there is a consumer who has a higher willingness to pay than the asking price, then they would want to buy this product. So, for instance, if you consider this case, Anthony has a willingness to pay of $250. He's okay to pay up to $250 for an iPod. You're only charging $200. Anthony actually would go ahead and buy an iPod, right? So Anthony is one consumer who's willing to purchase this iPod when the market price is $200. Chad, on the other hand, has a willingness to pay of only $175. The asking price is $200. The maximum price that Chad is willing to pay is $175. Chad stays out of the market, right? Flea, again, same story. $200 is the asking price. His willingness to pay is $300. So Flea will jump in and buy an iPod because he's willing to pay $300, but you're only asking for $200. And again, John has a lower willingness to pay than the price, right? That, in essence, first of all, captures the idea as to what the difference between willingness to pay and the asking prices, right? Between how you value a particular product and what it costs for you to get that product. So in this market, with this price of $200, only Anthony will want to buy an iPod, Flea will buy one iPod. They are the only two people who will be willing to buy an iPod. So the quantity demanded here is 2 units when the price is $200. Right. So from the willingness to pay, we can basically derive the entire demand curve, right? So at different price points or in different price ranges, we can figure out who buy, how much quantity demanded there is in the market. Okay, and how do we do this? So suppose the price of the iPod is $301 and more, right? Suppose the asking price in the market is $301 and more. None of the 4 consumers I have in this market are willing to pay anything more than 300. The most is Flea, who is willing to pay $300, but the price is over that willingness to pay. No one buys an iPod in this market, and the quantity demanded is 0. Right? No one is in this market to buy an iPod when the prices are over $301. All right. Suppose the price is set between $251 and $300. Okay, so it's set in this range between 251 and 300. Now, if I think about who will be willing to buy this iPod, okay, so Chad won't want to buy. John is going to stay out of it. Anthony is almost there, but he'll stay out of it. The only person who will be willing to buy when the price is set in this range is Flea, and we have a quantity demanded of 1 unit when the price is between $251 and $300. Okay, and similarly, when the price is set between 176 and 250, 176 and 250, Flea is still there because, all right, So he still wants to buy when the price is between 176 and 250. But now Anthony jumps into the market, right? Anthony is also willing to buy when the price is between 176 and 250 because his willingness to pay is higher than the price. Okay? So the quantity demanded then is 2 units. And if the price is set between 126 and 175, now it's not just Anthony flee. Chad also jumps in because his willingness to pay is 175 and the price is set below his willingness to pay. And finally, if the price is between 0 and $125, all four consumers jump in because the price is set at a level which is lower than their willingness to pay, and we have 4 units of iPods demanded in this market. So, in essence, when you think about what the demand curve is trying to get to, is establish a relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of this good. Right? That's what the demand curve is trying to do, and we basically can get a demand schedule out of it that way. Right? So this tells me the relationship between the price of an iPod at different ranges and the quantity demanded of iPods at each of those different price points. Right? And we can use this to basically generate a demand curve. Right? So when the price is above 300, so 301 and above, there is no demand. So that's basically where this portion of the demand curve comes from. It says that there is zero demand, zero quantity demanded when the price is above $301. Okay. So when the price is now between 300, when the price drops exactly to 300, now Flea jumps into the market and we have positive demand inside this market, and the demand is of 1 unit. So we move, when the price is 300, we move quantity demanded to 1 unit, and it stays at that 1 unit till the price drops to 250, right? Between 251 and 300, there's still only 1 unit of quantity demanded. That's why we get this vertical portion of this demand curve here. Right? What this says is that the quantity demanded stays the same at 1 unit between any price at 300 all the way up to 251. Right? So when the price now hits 250, the second person jumps into the market and the quantity demanded goes to 2 units. Right? So the quantity demanded now is 2 units, and it stays at that 2 units till the price comes down to 176. Right? Between 250 and 176, the quantity demanded is constant and it's going to stay at 2 units. Okay. And once the price hits 175, the third person jumps into the market. They generate one additional unit of demand. So the total quantity demand in the market is 3 units, and that will stay at that level till the price is up to $126. Right? And once the price goes to 150, the fourth person, the last consumer in this market, jumps in. They generate the demand of an additional unit, and then we can close off the rest of the demand. Right? So this is a way of generating a demand curve, right? So in a general sense, if you want to generate a demand curve, you look at what is the quantity demanded when prices are at different levels, right? If you don't know how, this is one idea about market research, right? So a new product comes into the market. So suppose you want to introduce a new product into the market. The question is to figure out what is the right pricing strategy, which is to say, first of all, let's figure out what the consumer demand looks like for this product. Okay. How do you figure out what the consumer demand is? So you can do surveys, right? You can talk to potential buyers of your product and ask them, all right, so if I charge you $300 and more for it, would you buy it? If you would buy it, how many units do you want at that price? And you might say, no one, most people might say, no, I don't want to pay more than $300 for it. And you might say, okay, that's like zero. Then you look at a different price range and ask these same consumers, all right, so if I charge you somewhere between $251 and $300, how many units would you be willing to buy? And through that, you can basically ferret out what the demand curve looks like for that particular product in the market. Right? So the willingness to pay is the starting point to generate the demand curve, right? But in general, right, when we talk about the demand curve, we talk about the demand curve as a smooth straight line, right? In a preliminary sense. This is what we do in a intro class, we can relax the assumption that the demand curve is a straight line in future classes. But for now, at the preliminary level, we always thought of it as a smooth line which is downward sloping. This was how we essentially described a demand curve. Now, when we look at this, we get like a step function, right? It looks like as if there is like these places where the demand stays constant over a certain price range. This is basically given because, right? Because there's only 4 consumers. In the typical market, there's going to be millions of consumers, so you're not going to get like a stepwise function. So at each price level, the quantity demanded is going to start going up, right? Because you're going to have more and more consumers at every single price level, and that's why you generate a smooth line like that, right? It's basically the step function gets smoothed out, and you can generate a smooth line there when you have a lot of consumers inside the market, and that's why the demand curve, when we draw it, we draw a straight line. Okay, all right. So the staircase shape. So if you think about this staircase shape, the formal way of defining this is what we call a step function. So there's a function which looks like there's a descending sets of steps or an ascending set of steps depending on where you start. But it looks like the demand curve looks like a staircase with 4 steps, one for per buyer, right? So if there are a huge number of buyers, then it's like there's like these small staircases. For each buyer, the size of the staircase gets minuscule, right? It still looks like a step function, but in a certain sense, it's like each of the size of each of these steps is going to be very small. And in general, if you have a lot of buyers, okay, I can't draw this. Okay, if you have a lot of buyers in this market, then the demand curve will look like a smooth curve. You will be able to generate a smooth curve out of it. Okay. All right. I hope things are clear so far. So the question then is, how do we read the demand curve, right? And using the stepwise function, right? So what it tells me is that the height of the curve. So if I take the height of the curve at any given point, right? If I look at this vertical distance, if I look at the height of the curve is going to tell me the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, right? So here, if I look at the height of the curve here, the marginal buyer is Flea, and Flea has a willingness to pay of $300. That tells me the maximum price that the consumer is willing to pay to receive that product, right? So at any given point in any part of this demand curve, if I look at the height of the demand curve, that tells me the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, right? So the marginal buyer is a crucial concept, right? The marginal buyer essentially is the buyer who is going to be willing to leave the market if the price were any higher. So he is marginal in the sense that if the price moved from 250 to 251, Anthony would immediately leave the market because it's above Anthony's willingness to pay, so he's going to leave the market at that point. So when the price is there between 251 and 250, the marginal buyer is Anthony, right? That's because if the price is 251, Anthony exits the market. If the price is 250, Anthony jumps into the market. At that price, Anthony's willingness to pay determines whether an additional unit of the good is sold or not. Okay, so the marginal buyer essentially determines whether one additional unit of demand is generated or not. Okay, all right. So then we'll go on and talk about an interesting idea about how do we measure welfare in general. So when we talk about welfare, we talk about surplus, right? Surplus is an easy enough idea, right? When we talk about consumer surplus, right, let me actually pick up the other colors. So I think that's brighter. All right. So when we talk about consumer surplus, we are looking at the difference between how much you're willing to pay and what you're asked to pay, right? So this is your WTP. It tells me your willingness to pay for this good. P here is the price that I ask you to pay for this good. The bigger this difference is, the better off you are, right? If you're willing to pay $1,000 for a good, that's your willingness to pay, and I ask you only for $100 for the same good, that difference is $900. You were willing to spend up to $1,000, but then I asked you only for $100, so you essentially didn't have to spend the $900 that you were actually willing to pay, and that's your consumer surplus, right? So the difference between the willingness to pay and the actual price that is paid to have this good, that's how we define consumer surplus. Okay. So let's consider when the price is $260. Okay, if the price is $260, the only person in this market is going to be Flea. Okay, no one else is going to buy anything. And Flea's consumer surplus would be his willingness to pay, which is $300, minus the cost, minus the price, I should say, minus the price that he's asked to pay, and the difference is $40, right? The other consumers, the other potential consumers in this market, don't receive any consumer surplus because their willingness to pay is lower than the asking price. They stay out of the market, so they don't get any consumer surplus because they don't buy an iPod at this price. Right? So the total consumer surplus generated in this market when the price is set at $260 is basically $40, right? The price is 260, Flea's willingness to pay is 300. The difference between those two tells me what the consumer surplus looks like. Okay, and if you want to look at it on a graph, right? So this is 260. This is where the market price. The blue line essentially tells me where the market price is set at. The price is 260. Suppose Flea's willingness to pay is 300. The difference here is 40. Okay, the difference here is 40, and then he's willing to buy one unit at this price level at $260. He's willing to buy one unit. So the area of this rectangle here, length times breadth, 40 times 1, tells me that total consumer surplus is $40. Okay. All right. Straightforward. It's very intuitive idea, consumer surplus, just looking at the difference between willingness to pay and the price that's actually charged. Okay. So what happens if the price instead of being 260 is at 200? Okay. If the price is at $200, or if the price is at 220, sorry. So if the price is set to 220, so the blue line here represents $220. Now, two things happen. First, Flea is still in the market. Flea's willingness to pay is 300, but now the asking price is only 220, so his consumer surplus goes up. Right? The difference, the consumer surplus, Flea's consumer surplus, is the difference between his willingness to pay and the actual price that he pays. Right? So the difference here is 300 minus 220, so $80. Earlier, the consumer surplus was $40 when the price was 260, but now the consumer surplus is $80 because the price has gone down. Okay, so that's this part of this rectangle. A second thing happens. When the price is set to 220, the second person, Anthony, jumps into the market as well. Right? Anthony's willingness to pay is 250. The price is 200. So now Anthony's consumer surplus in this case would be his willingness to pay minus the price he's asked to pay. He's willing to pay 250. He's asked to pay 220. The difference is his consumer surplus, so that's $30. So when the price is set to 220, the total consumer surplus in this market is Flea's consumer surplus plus Anthony's consumer surplus, which is a grand total of $110. Okay, which is basically the consumer surplus tells me the area under the curve. So if I really want to separate it, I look at it as this is Flea's consumer surplus and this is Anthony's consumer surplus, and add both of them. That tells me the area under the demand curve. So the total consumer surplus in general is the area under the demand curve above the price, right? It's above this price that the set tells me where the base of this is going to end up, above the price, and that goes between 0 to Q. right, to the quantity demanded at that price. Right? So this area here, which is below the demand curve but above the price, and the cutoff of this area is determined by the quantity demanded at that cutoff price, at the price that what we are setting to. When the price is set to 220, the cutoff is determined by the fact that there's only 2 units sold, so it goes from 0 to 2. Okay, so in general, this is a important idea to make sure you internalize, that the consumer surplus is measuring the area below the demand curve and above the price between 0 and the quantity demanded at the price. Okay. So let's consider a more general case. How do we calculate consumer surpluses in markets where there's a lots of buyers, right? First of all, when we have a lot of buyers, imagine we get a smooth demand curve, right? We get a very smooth demand curve, so we get a straight line, a linear straight line, which is downward sloping. Okay. Now, how do I calculate uh, the consumer surplus? All right. Now, when Q here is measured, okay, so it's the demand for shoes. P here is measuring the price per pair of shoes, and Q here is the quantity demanded of shoes in the thousands, right? So when the quantity demanded is 5,000 units, right? So right here, the marginal buyer has a willingness to pay of 50 bucks, right? So to sell an additional unit, the price needs to go down from 50 bucks to something slightly low. So the marginal buyer is willing to pay 50 bucks. So if I raise the price even by a small amount, I lose the marginal buyer, right? So this price here is going to determine what the willingness to pay is for the marginal buyer. For the buyer who's in a position to take it or leave it, and he's just on the fence, and if the price goes down a little bit, he'll jump into the market. If the price goes up by a little bit, he'll exit the market. Okay. So suppose the price is 30 bucks, right? Suppose the price is 30 bucks per pair of shoes. Okay. Now imagine who will buy the shoes, right? Imagine all the people who will buy the shoes, right? First of all, this person, the first buyer who enters the market, so there is no demand for shoes if you charge more than 60 bucks for it. So in a certain sense, here you have zero demand. Okay. When you set the price at just at 60 bucks, the first person jumps in, right? And so the first person is going to buy and then as the price starts to go down, as you start dropping the price, this person will jump in, the second person will jump in, because each of these people have if I consider this difference here at any point, it tells me the difference between the marginal buyer's willingness to pay. So this is how much the marginal buyer is willing to pay versus how much I'm asking them to pay, right? Here, when the quantity demanded is 5,000 units, the marginal buyer's willingness to pay is 50 bucks, but I'm asking them to pay only 30 bucks. The difference is their consumer surplus, and the consumer surplus in this case is going to be $20. Okay, so that's true at any of these points, right? If I consider this difference between any of these 2 points, here the marginal buyer has a willingness to pay of, let's say, 55 bucks. I'm asking them to pay 30 bucks, so their consumer surplus will be 25. Okay. All right. So when the price is 30 bucks, there's 15,000 units, right? Because the axis is measuring in thousands of units. So when the price is 30 bucks, there's about 15,000 units worth of demand inside this market. Consumer surplus is the area, okay, is the area below the demand curve, is this area, and above the price, the base is set by the price, going from 0 to the quantity demand at that price. So the base is drawn from here to the demand curve. Okay. So the consumer surplus, the total consumer surplus in this market is going to be the area of this triangle here. Why does it make sense? Because imagine the first marginal buyer, his willingness to pay is $60. You're only asking them to pay $30. This difference is their consumer surplus, and they would definitely buy, right? The second buyer in this market would have a willingness to pay which is almost close to $60. You're asking them for $30, so they'll jump in. So every single buyer whose willingness to pay is above the market price or the price that I set at will jump in. But if I get to this point, right, imagine what happens here. Here the willingness to pay is like $31. The price I'm charging is 30. The difference is fairly small. The consumer surplus is getting smaller and smaller for each of these marginal buyers, right? The buyer with the highest willingness to pay will have the highest consumer surplus, and then the last buyer who determines whether they buy a unit or not at $30, they have basically the least amount of consumer surplus. But in aggregate, the total consumer surplus generated at this price inside this market is the sum of each of their individual consumer surpluses, which is basically the area of this triangle here. Okay. So to calculate the area of a triangle, you know the formula. The area of the triangle is 1/2 times the base, which is this, times the height, which is this. Okay. So the height here is 60 minus 30. So the height of the triangle here is 60 minus 30, or $30. And the base of this triangle goes from 0 to 15. So that's 15. So this base of the triangle is 15. So the consumer surplus, the total consumer surplus in this market is 1/2 times the base times the height. The base is 15, the height is 30, and the consumer surplus therefore is $225. Okay. Now imagine what happens if prices go up. Okay. Suppose the price goes up from $30 to $40. Okay. If the price goes up from $30 to $40, now we are going to lose a few. Okay, let me stop before I talk about what happens and the dynamics of how we get from 30 to $40. Imagine what happens if I raise the price from 30 to $40. Okay, the person whose willingness to pay was $60 is still in the market, right? There's willingness to pay was 60. The price is higher than it was before. It's 40, which means that the consumer surplus for that buyer is now lower, right? They're willing to pay 60. Earlier they were asked to pay only 30, so then their consumer surplus was 30. They're still willing to pay 60, but they're now asked to pay 40, which means that their consumer surplus is now lower. Okay. So the consumer surplus in this market when the price is 40, first of all, is the height of this triangle, which is 60 minus 40, which is 20, times the base of this triangle. The base is that at the price of $40, there's only 10 units which of quantity demanded, so that's 10. So the base is 10, the height is 20, 1/2 times the base times height. That tells me what the consumer surplus is. Okay, so the consumer surplus, the total consumer surplus in this market is now $100. Okay, so if I go back to the previous slide, here the total consumer surplus in this market when the price was 30 was 225. When the price goes up, the total consumer surplus in this market is 100. So that's a decline. Consumer surplus in this market has gone down by $125. When the price went up from 30 to $40, consumer surplus in this market has fallen by $125. Okay, what's happening? Okay, two things. First thing is that if I raise the price from 30 to $40, I'm going to lose a few buyers, right? I'm going to price out some buyers from this market. Why is that the case? If the price is $30, the marginal buyer, the buyer whose willingness to pay is slightly above $30, will stay in the market and buy a good. So if I start raising prices, the person whose willingness to pay is 30 won't buy anymore once the price is raised to 40. So basically, I move along this demand curve. I lose all of these buyers who would be willing to buy if the price is 30 or anything less than 40. So these are all buyers who are willing to pay something between 30 and $40 to get a pair of shoes. none of them will stay in the market once I raise the price to $40, right? I lose all of these buyers from this market. So I lose this amount of consumer surplus because I lose all of these buyers. All of these buyers exit from this market. Okay, so the size of this loss from consumers exiting this market is the size of area of this triangle is 1/2 times the height times the base. The base is now 5, right? Because the base is now 15 minus 10, which is 5, and then the height is 40 minus 30, which is 10. So the size of this triangle is going to be 1/2 times the base times the height. 1/2 times 10 times 5 is 50 over 2, which is $25, right? So this accounts for a drop in the consumer surplus of about negative $25, right? There is this triangle here basically accounts for, of the $125 reduction in consumer surplus when the price is raised from $30 to $40, $25 is accounted for the fact that when I raise prices, I'm going to lose buyers, and this is the amount of consumer surplus which is lost because buyers are leaving the market at higher prices. Okay. The second reason for why the consumer surplus is falling is that all these other buyers who are still left in the market, all these buyers whose willingness to pay is above $40, stay on in the market, continue to generate demand inside this market, but each of their consumer surplus is now lower, right? Earlier, the guy whose willingness to pay was 60 was earning a consumer surplus of $30. Now, when the price is 40, the same consumer whose willingness to pay is 60 is now earning only a consumer surplus of $20 because the difference is 20. And that's true for each and every single of these buyers who are still staying in the market. Each of them is now faced with higher prices, right? Each of the remaining buyers is paying a higher price, and that's reducing their amount of consumer welfare or consumer surplus. And how much is that going down by is the area of this rectangle. So the height here, the height length here is 10, the breadth here is 10, length times breadth. So this triangle accounts for a drop in the consumer surplus of $100. So this rectangle, I should say, sorry. So this rectangle accounts for a drop in the consumer surplus of $100, right? So in net, the total consumer surplus is getting reduced by $125. $25 of that is getting lost because buyers are exiting the market when the prices are raised, and the remaining $100 of consumer surplus is lost because the remaining buyers in the market are now faced with higher prices, and that's reducing their consumer surplus. Okay. All right. So we'll finish off this session by looking at an example and how to apply this, so you can start working through the homework questions. So let's start with the demand curve in a market. So, I have the demand curve charted out. So the price versus quantity, we have the demand curve charted out, and it's a smooth line and it's a straight line, downward sloping straight line. Okay. What is the marginal buyer's willingness to pay when the quantity is 10? Okay. How do I find this? So quantity is 10, right? So if when the quantity is 10, I look up here in the demand curve, and the marginal buyer has willingness to pay of $30. Okay, we'll consider each of these cases, right? So when the quantity is 10 units, the marginal buyer has a willingness to pay of $30. Right? How do I get that? So I basically look at this. At 10, I go up to the demand curve and pick up the price at that level. Why is this person the marginal buyer when the quantity is 10? If the price goes up by even a small amount, if the price goes up from 30 to 30.1 cent, right? $30 and a cent, I'm going to lose this buyer. That buyer is going to just stay out of the market because the willingness to pay is only $30. They won't pay a cent more than $30, and they just leave the market. Okay. And then if the price moves down even by a small amount, an additional buyer is going to jump into the market. So this is when the quantity is 10 units, the marginal buyer has a willingness to pay of 30 bucks. Okay. All right. Let's consider the second situation. So if the price is set at 30 bucks, okay, the price is set at 30 bucks, what is the consumer surplus? Okay. So if the price is set at 30 bucks, okay, maybe I'll use a different color so it doesn't clash with the uh, demand curve. So when the price is 30 bucks, the quantity is 10 units, and the consumer surplus, remember, is the area under the demand curve above the price, where the base is determined by going from 0 to the quantity demanded at that price. So it's the area of this triangle here. That's the consumer surplus, right? How do I find the area of this triangle? It's 1/2 times the base times height. So 1/2 is 1/2. Base here, the size of the base is 0 to 10. So the base here is 10 units. So this here is 10. And the height is going to be 40 minus 30. So the height is also 10. So 1/2 times the base times height. This is 50 bucks. Okay, so the consumer surplus when the price in the market is set to 30 bucks is $50. Okay. Now suppose the price falls to 20 bucks. So instead of charging 30 bucks, the price in the market falls to $20. Okay. Let me actually erase my pen out of it. Okay. So when the price is 30 bucks, the consumer surplus is the area of this triangle here. And the area of this triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height. And so that's a consumer surplus of 50 bucks. So when the price falls to 20 bucks, the total consumer surplus, right? So the total consumer surplus is now the area of this bigger triangle here. The area of this bigger triangle, and if I wanted to just calculate the total consumer surplus directly, I would look at the height and I would look at the base and 1/2 times the base times height. So the height here is 40 minus 20, so this is going to be 20, and the base is going to be going from 0 to 20, so the base is 20. So the area of this new triangle is going to be 1/2 times the base times the height. The base is 20, the height is 20, so 1/2 times 20 times 20, that's 200, right? So the total consumer surplus when the price goes down to 20 is $200. Okay? And you can look at it as disaggregated into two effects, right? When the price goes down to 20, first of all, when the price was at 30 bucks, there was about 10 units worth of this good being demanded. When the price is 20, there's 10 more people who enter this market, right? So here there's 10 additional units which get sold when the price, or get demanded, I shouldn't say sold, when 10 additional units that get demanded when the price is set to 20, right? So one part of the increase in consumer surplus, right? Remember the total increase, the total consumer surplus is now $200 when the price is 20. So this is an increase of $150, right? When the price was set to 30 bucks, the consumer surplus was 50 bucks. So when the price is set to $200, the total consumer surplus is 200, which is an increase in consumer surplus of 150. Okay. One part of this increase is coming from the fact that at a lower price, more buyers are willing to enter into the market and purchase, and the additional consumer surplus that's generated by that activity is the size of this triangle here, which is 1/2 times the base, which is 10 units, times the height, which is 10 units, right? So 1/2 times the base times the height, so $50 of additional consumer surplus is being generated inside this market because there's new buyers. This is the consumer surplus for additional buyers. The second part of the increase in consumer surplus is accounted for the fact that these initial buyers who are generating 10 units worth of demand. Now each of them has a higher consumer surplus, right? So the additional consumer surplus, so intuitively, if you argue for the situation, think of what's happening here. The person whose willingness to pay was $40 before, right? Their willingness to pay is $40. Earlier, they were asked to pay $30 and their consumer surplus was $10, if that was the case. Now, the same consumer whose willingness to pay has not changed, is still willing to pay $40, is now asked to pay only $20, so their consumer surplus has gone up by an additional $10. They're able to put an additional $10 in their pocket than they were before. And that's true for all of these existing consumers in this market. When the price was $30, that's about 10 units worth. So the additional consumer surplus generated on the initial 10 units that were getting demanded in this market is the area of this rectangle here. So the area of this rectangle here is the height, the length times breadth. The length here is 10, the breadth here is 10, so that's 10 times 10, and that's $100. Okay, so the total consumer surplus in this market is now $200, which is an additional $150 than when what the consumer surplus was when the price was higher. Okay, I know it's a little bit confusing the first time you see this, so if there's any questions, just ask in the comments below the video, or send me an email, or see me in office hours. But and you'll get enough practice working on these types of questions on the homework. But I hope it's fairly clear as to what's happening. All right. So I'll stop the session here. So in the next session, we'll pick up and talk about producer surplus, and then we'll finish up the discussion around the efficiency of the markets. All right. Okay. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.